Hello and welcome into a new lesson. So today's topic is going to be about contrastive analysis. We will get to know what do we mean exactly by contrastive analysis and everything related to it. So let's get started. The first thing that you should keep in mind when you speak about contrastive analysis is that it's all about making comparisons. And so we are doing what? We are comparing two languages to spot the similarities and the differences between these two languages. So it is also good to know that it was based on the assumption that language teachers, they could predict learners' errors and thus help them overcome their difficulties. So the main objective and the main goal and purpose of CA was to enable teachers to predict learners' errors before they occur to help them overcome their difficulties. Now, you may ask me to specify, what do you mean exactly by comparing two languages? So we do compare the target language, which is the new language or the L2, the language that the learner wishes to learn, with the mother tongue, which is the native language or the L1. And that's to do what? That's to spot the difficulties, to spot the similarities and the differences between these two languages. And so basically contrastive analysis is a systematic study, which means it is structured and it is done according to a fixed plan. And so it's a systematic study of a pair of languages to do what? To identify their differences and similarities. So this is something that we already know. The new thing here is that at the level of structure, and we will get to know why exactly at the level of structure. That will lead us directly to Charles Fries in 1945. He was Lado's teacher. We will get to know Lado in a few seconds. So according to Fries, the most efficient materials are those that are based upon a scientific description of the language to be learned. And when we say a scientific description, you can see here with me the shift in linguistics towards the scientific description of language, and that is to say words order, pronunciation, phonology, morphology, syntax, etc. Okay? Carefully compared with what? With a parallel structure or a parallel description of the native language of the learner. Okay? Now, coming to Ulrich Weinreich and Hogan, the 1953, they made extensive studies on the effects of language in contact and the distortions that result in bilingual situations. And Max Weinreich, who is the father of Ulrich, said that language is a dialect with an army and a navy. I repeat, language is a dialect with an army and a navy, and we can understand the plethora of things just from reading this statement. Now, coming to Robert Lado. In the 1957, he laid down the foundation of CA theory, or CAH, and he suggested a set of theoretical procedures with the objective of doing what? Of predicting learning difficulties before they occur. And so in the 1960s, theoreticians, they have expected the possibility of designing language courses. So this is one of the aims of CAH, is to design language courses for a better proficiency. So they wanted to make use of the findings of those theoretical procedures to design language courses that will help the learners reach a certain level of proficiency. One other aim or one other purpose of CA was to provide input to applied linguistics. And what do we mean exactly by applied linguistics? So it has to do with foreign language teaching and translation studies. Okay, so when we speak about CA or CAH, it is not solely about learning or teaching, but it's also about translation. This is exactly why when I was learning CA in class, and I had that notion that we are doing translation because we were carefully comparing two languages at the level of structure, and it felt like it was translation. Another vital point is that we have two interfaces. So we are not only interested by the theory or the theoretical procedures, but also about the application. And this is what Guest said in 2015. It makes use of theoretical findings, like I said before, and models of language description, but it is always driven by the objective of applicability. So this is everything about CA. Now let's move to CAH, which is the contrastive analysis hypothesis. Okay? So contrastive analysis hypothesis is actually an extension of the notion of CA, okay, originated from Lado's Linguistics Across Cultures in the 1957. According to Lado, L1 transfer affects L2 acquisition. Okay. And so at the time, that was at the time of structural linguistics and behavioral psychology dominance. This is exactly why we said at the level of structure. It was the time of dissocier, of that shift that happened in linguistics and behavioral psychology dominance. We will get to know what do we mean exactly by this in the coming slides. And so according to Lado, those elements which are similar to the learner's native language will be simple for him. So keep in mind, similar, simple. And those elements that are different will be difficult. And so different, difficult, similar, simple. That's it. And so according to Lado, individuals tend to do what? Tend to transfer forms and meanings and the distribution of forms and meanings of their native language and culture to the foreign language and culture. And so what he wanted to say is that we don't transfer only words, characters, letters, but we do transfer forms, we do transfer meanings. And not meanings in isolation, but meanings in a relation to culture. And so he wanted to integrate culture as a new element in CA. And he said both productively and receptively. Of course, productively when the learner attempts to speak the language and to act in the culture, and receptively when the learner attempts to grasp or to understand the language and the culture as practiced by the natives. And so, again, according to Lado, we can predict and describe the pattern that will cause difficulty and learning those that will not cause difficulty by doing what? By comparing systematically the language and culture. And you see here the language and culture to be learned with the native language and culture of the students. Now let's take a look at the association of CA with behavioral psychology. The first thing is, so there are two notions, okay? The first thing or the first notion was the habit formation plus reinforcement. For me personally, whenever I hear these two words, like these two sentences or two phrases, habit formation plus reinforcement, it reminds me directly of Skinner's verbal behavior in the 1957. And so according to Skinner, we've learned our first language through habit formation plus reinforcement. And you're going to hear a lot of words like punishment, reward, stimulus, response. These were the notions and the ideas cooking back then. The second notion was the notion of transfer, as Pitt Corder in the 1971. It was actually based on Skinner's verbal behavior, if we may say, because he said that one explanation is that the learner is carrying over the habits of his mother tongue into the second language. Okay, and so this was the impact of behavioral psychology, or the association of behavioral psychology with contrastive analysis. Now let's get back to CAH and let's take a look at the procedure of CAH. So according to Lado, first we have to describe. Okay, so there is a description. We describe the two languages, the L1 and the L2, and then we select. So there is a selection. We pick or we choose a structure, a pattern that you wish to do. What we wish to compare, and then we contrast. So that particular structure, that particular chosen pattern, we try to make a comparison between the target language and the native language, and then we predict the level of difficulty. Okay, so we have three predictions basically. There is a positive transfer if these two structures are similar, like the plural S in English, French, and Spanish. Okay, this is a positive transfer, similar structures, no problem, no difficulty. There is a negative transfer when we find different structures. Okay, when we find different structures, that this is a negative transfer, which means there is a level of difficulty here, like trouser between Arabic, French versus English. There is a zero transfer when there is no relation, okay, like in Arabic dual aynai versus in English my eyes. And so there is no relation, which means there are no similarities and no differences. Okay. Another vital point is the versions. okay, of CA. So according to Wardolph in the 1970s, he proposed a distinction between the strong version of CA and the weak one. The strong version of CA is a priori, which means before the error occurs, okay, they predict it. Okay, the weak version is a posteriori, which means after the error occurs, they go and they try to analyze it. Okay, as easy and simple as that. Now coming to the versions of CA or the models, okay, so we have a simplistic model and we have a sophisticated model. The simplistic model, it has to do with linguistics differences that are based simply on what? On similarities and differences alone. Of course, it could be used to predict learners' difficulties. The sophisticated model, on the other hand, is based on a hierarchy of difficulties. We will see the hierarchy of difficulties in the coming slides. So now let's summarize everything. It looks like physics, right? So first we have the CA, and then with time we turn to CAH with Lado, of course. And of course with the strong version, because we said that they were trying to predict errors. So it was a priori, it was strong version. And then we got back to the CA again, because the CAH failed. The CA, of course, we have a strong version, and we have the weak version. The weak version was the one that survived in the error analysis. So this is a new term. Error analysis came after CA, or the CAH failed. So now let's take a look at why did the CAH fail? Okay, what were the reasons? So we have 4 main reasons here. The first one is the mispredictions. So they had a lot of shortcomings, and so sometimes they overpredicted. Some errors didn't occur at all, and sometimes they underpredicted. So some errors occurred and they didn't predict them. And so that was hard for them. That was a flaw in the CAH. Another reason, the levels of hierarchy could not account for all linguistic problems. So they tried to put the language into that small space. It was not enough. This is another manifestation of the complexity of language. Another reason was Chomsky's nativist theory, okay? And so the basis that CAH was built upon suddenly shifted from Skinner's verbal behavior to Chomsky's nativist theory. Because Chomsky believed that there is a language acquisition device latent in the brain. And so this is a new notion entirely. And it made, CAH fail. Another reason is the relation to behaviorism in general. Now let's take a look at the models of hierarchy. We've been saying models of hierarchy, simplistic models, sophisticated models. So let's take a look at these. So in the models of hierarchy, pay attention, they are all as priori, they are all a strong version, okay? We have 2 things, or 2 models of hierarchy. The first one is the sophisticated model of hierarchy of Stockwell, Bowen, and Martin in the 1965. They moved from hard to easy. So they have started with split. Split is when you have 1 item in your native language that will become 2 items in the target language, like for in English, por para in Spanish. And then new is when there is an item in your native language, or there is no item in your native language, and there is a representation of that in the target language. Like in English, we don't have le, la that exist in French. Absent is when there is an item in your language that doesn't exist in the target language, so you have to forget about it. Like at the syntactic level, do in English, in some cases. In French, it doesn't exist. Coalesced or fused is when you have 2 items in your target language that will become 1 item when you have 2 items in your native language that will fuse and become 1 item in the target language, like his and her in English that will become just su in Spanish. And then, of course, you have correspondence, which is transfer or positive transfer, is when there is an item, it's the same. Okay, it's similar, like ing in English and ando in Spanish. Now let's take a look at the second model of hierarchy. Of course, all as prior, like I said before. This is Prater's model in the 1967. They moved from easy to hard. So the only differences between this model and the previous one, at first, the sophisticated models put in mind that since it is sophisticated, they have started from hard to easy. Okay. And for the Prater's model, from easy to hard. This is the first difference. The second difference is that in the Prater's model, they have added a new level of difficulty, which is reinterpretation. Okay? Other than that, they are similar. They have just changed the word. They have used some synonyms here and there, but it represents the same thing. Okay? So we said that they moved from easy to hard. So we have transfer, no difference, general word order, subject, verb, object, the plural as, etc. Then coalescence, fusion, is when you have two items in your native language that will fuse and become one item in the target language. Ender differentiation, when there is an item in your language that doesn't exist in the other language, so you have to forget about it. Reinterpretation, when there is an item in your native language that is given a new distribution, a new shape in the target language. Like for instance, the in Persian they have clear l at the phonological level. But in English, we have dark and clear lens, so this is a difference. This is, let's say, a new shape, a new distribution for that particular item. And then we have over differentiation when there is no item in your native language and there is a representation of that in the target language, so you have to learn it. And split, which is the hardest. Okay, split is when you have one item only in your native language that will become two items or more in the target language. Okay, as simple and easy as that. We can already, say that these predictions had shortcomings. Okay, and so the levels of difficulty that we've seen just now could not account for all linguistic patterns. So whenever you try to find errors and then to predict errors, and then you find yourself like you cannot use these models of hierarchy because they could not account for all linguistic patterns. Plus, the difficulty level is not verified with reliability, and so this was a problem. This was a flaw in the CAH, and thus this is exactly why, ergo, the weak version, which is the posteriori, survived as an error analysis. Okay, so we will get to know more about error analysis in the coming lesson. Until then, take care.